Welcome to the Deep Dive. Ready to explore a topic that always seems to spark debate.
Always.
Today, it's the start of human life. And we've got some fascinating research from Professor Nicolas Jouve, a geneticist, to guide us.
You know, it's interesting because this research was actually presented at a pro-life conference in Spain a few years back.
I see, in 2018.
Right, 2018. But what makes it really intriguing is that Jouve doesn't really lean on religious arguments.
Oh, that's interesting. So it's not about beliefs or faith.
Not at all. He dives straight into the science, examining the evidence for when human life begins.
That's what we're all about here on the Deep Dive. It's often said that being pro-life is purely a religious stance, but Jouve's approach offers a different perspective.
Absolutely. And it challenges us to consider the scientific evidence regardless of our personal beliefs.
So let's dive in. What does Jouve say about the beginning of human life?
Well, he actually refers to conception as the Big Bang of a human life.
The Big Bang. That's a powerful analogy.
It is. He's essentially saying that the fusion of the sperm and egg creates a whole new entity, the zygote. And that's where unique human life truly begins.
So he's arguing that the zygote isn't just part of the mother's body, but its own distinct being from that very first moment.
Precisely. Yeah. And he even quotes Dr. Angelo Serra, a geneticist who specializes in this area. Serra states that the zygote is the exact point, both in time and space, where an individual human life cycle starts.
Wow, that's a pretty strong statement. But what makes a zygote so different from the sperm and egg individually? What sets it apart?
Well, think about it this way. The zygote has its own unique set of 23 pairs of chromosomes. That's its own unique DNA blueprint for development, completely different from both parents.
So it's like the zygote is given its own unique roadmap from day one. It's already on its own individual path.
Exactly. And from that point on, the zygote is on its own unique trajectory. And you know what Jouve emphasizes?
What's that?
That human development from this moment forward is self-regulated, gradual, and continuous.
Okay, those are some pretty big words. Can you break those down for us a little bit? What does he mean by self-regulated?
Sure. Self-regulated means that the zygote has all the instructions it needs within itself to grow and develop.
It's not dependent on something external.
Right. It doesn't need outside intervention to guide its development. Imagine it like this. It's got its own internal GPS system guiding its journey.
That's a great analogy. And what about gradual development? What does that mean in this context?
Well, it simply means that development happens in stages, becoming more complex over time. Think about building a skyscraper.
You don't just build it all at once, that's for sure.
Exactly. You wouldn't expect the whole thing to be finished in a day. It takes time to lay the foundation, then build the floors, one by one.
So it's a step-by-step process, right? There's no sudden leap from one stage of development to the next.
Right, and that's where continuous comes in.
Yeah.
Jouve is really highlighting the idea that it's a seamless process.
I see. So from the zygote to the embryo to the fetus, and then finally a newborn baby, it's all one continuous flow of development.
You got it. And this is where Jouve really challenges a common argument, the argument that an early embryo is just a clump of cells.
Ah, yes, I've heard that one before. What's his take on that?
Well, he sees it as a massive oversimplification. Of course, an embryo is made up of cells.
But it's more than just the sum of its parts.
Precisely. It's the organization of those cells, the internal direction, the way they're working together that matters. Think of it this way. A pile of bricks is just a pile of bricks.
Right. Until you start building something.
Exactly. But when those bricks are arranged according to a blueprint, when they start forming a structure, they become something much more. They have a purpose and a direction.
It's not just about the building blocks themselves. It's about the potential within them and the plan they're following.
You got it. And that leads us to a much deeper question. If human development is this continuous process, does that mean all stages of life have the same inherent value?
That's where things get really thought-provoking. Because there are definitely people who argue that human value should be based on things like, I don't know, cognitive ability or stage of development.
Absolutely. You know, some philosophers, like Tristram Engelhardt, believe that full personhood actually requires self-awareness.
Oh, interesting. So until you're self-aware, you're not a person.
Well, this line of thinking suggests that adults, with their more developed cognitive abilities, have a higher moral status than, say, embryos or even infants.
That's definitely a controversial standpoint. It seems to suggest that someone isn't fully human until they reach a certain level of consciousness.
It's a complex issue, no doubt. But there are strong arguments against this perspective as well.
Oh, tell me more about those.
Okay, for example, Maria Dolores Villacaro, who's a legal scholar specializing in bioethics, argues that our capabilities actually unfold because we're already persons.
So it's not our abilities that make us human, but our humanity that allows us to develop those abilities.
Exactly. It's like saying a seed isn't a tree until it's fully grown.
I get it. So where does Juve stand in all of this?
Zhu really emphasizes that every stage of human life from that very first moment of conception deserves respect and protection.
He sees inherent value in all those stages.
Precisely. He's concerned about any viewpoint that might assign different values to human life based purely on its developmental stage.
And this concern seems to tie into his views on practices like IVF, right? We touched on that earlier.
Exactly. IVF is one area he focuses on, but he also expresses concerns about other practices that he sees as potentially undermining the inherent value of human life.
Like what?
Well, abortion, for one, and eugenics for another.
So practices that involve making choices about which lives are more valuable than others?
Essentially, yes. He views abortion as an act that ends a human life with potential consequences for both the fetus and the mother. And he cautions against eugenics, which seeks to control reproduction to promote desirable traits.
So his main concern is that these practices, even if they have good intentions, could ultimately lead us down a slippery slope where we start devaluing certain human lives based on characteristics or conditions.
That's a key takeaway from this first part of our deep dive. Juve's argument centers on the idea that scientific evidence supports conception as the beginning of human life, and that all stages of this life should be valued and protected.
That's a lot to consider. We've covered a lot of ground, from the science of conception to the complex ethical challenges posed by various practices. But what does this mean for our listeners? How does it challenge their own assumptions and understanding? That's what we'll explore in part 2, where we'll delve deeper into the implications of Juve's arguments and look at some different perspectives on these incredibly complex issues. Stay tuned. Back again for more of the deep dive. Still with us as we unpack Professor Nicolas Juve's research on the beginning of human life.
Absolutely. And ready to tackle some of the different opinions this topic raises.
Perfect, because last time we really focused on Juve's argument, right? The one that leans on scientific evidence to pinpoint conception as the start of life.
Right. But it's important to remember, this research has sparked a lot of discussion and debate. People don't always agree where to draw the line.
And that's what makes these deep dives so interesting. So let's hear those other viewpoints. If not at conception, then where do some people say human life truly begins?
Well, some folks believe that consciousness is a more relevant marker.
Consciousness? Like when you become aware of yourself and your surroundings.
Exactly. Or some folks point to the ability to feel pain. Those are seen as key indicators for them.
Okay, so not a fixed point in time like conception, but more about when certain capacities emerge.
Right. And then there's a whole group that emphasizes the moment of birth.
Makes sense. That's when an individual is physically separate from the mother.
Exactly. And, these aren't just theoretical debates. They have real-world consequences.
Oh, absolutely. This stuff impacts everything from healthcare to legal rights.
Right. They influence reproductive rights, policies, even the legal definition of personhood itself.
It's heavy stuff. So let's say just for a moment we entertain Juve's idea, full moral status for a zygote. What would that mean for things like abortion or even IVF?
Yeah, those are the big questions, aren't they? I mean, if embryos are considered persons, wow, that throws a wrench into a lot of things.
Like even the process of IVF, right? Creating and storing embryos, what are our responsibilities there?
Huge ethical considerations for sure.
You mentioned this idea of a slippery slope earlier. Could you unpack that a bit more for us?
Sure. It's the idea that if you accept a certain premise, it might lead to unintended consequences down the line. Unforeseen outcomes,
So like a chain reaction where things keep escalating.
In a way, yeah. Some people worry that if we base the value of human life solely on certain abilities, it could open the door to discrimination.
Ah, I see. Treating some lives as less important because they don't meet specific criteria.
Exactly. Like, think about folks with disabilities or those in comas. Are their lives less valuable?
It's a sobering thought.
It is. And that's why discussions like this one, spurred by Juve's research, are so important.
They force us to confront these really tough questions.
He's pushing us to think critically, to examine how science, ethics, and different values all play a role in how we view and protect life in all its forms.
And to be fair to Juve, he's not just throwing out scientific data. He's acknowledging the broader ethical and philosophical questions, too.
Exactly. And that's what makes this deep dive so engaging. It's not just about facts and figures, but grappling with the meaning of being human.
And how we treat each other, right?
Absolutely. I think Ju would agree that these conversations, even the difficult ones, are crucial to have. They shape our society, our values.
Okay, so after all of this, what are some practical takeaways for our listeners? What can they do with this information?
I think the biggest takeaway is the importance of informed consent. No matter your personal beliefs, thoughtful consideration is key.
So whether it's a couple deciding about IVF, someone facing an unplanned pregnancy, or society as a whole wrestling with end-of-life care.
We need to be aware, understand the different views out there and the potential consequences of our choices.
It goes beyond personal choices too, right?
Oh yeah, this impacts social values, healthcare, even how we define human in a technological age.
Big picture stuff.
Juve reminds us, science isn't just cold, hard facts. It carries ethical and philosophical weight.
He's pushing us to examine how scientific progress could either uphold or undermine the value of human life.
Absolutely. And as technology keeps advancing, having these conversations about boundaries becomes even more crucial.
It's like we're trying to strike a balance, isn't it, between progress and safeguarding human dignity.
Exactly. And these conversations need diverse voices. Scientists, ethicists, everyday people. A dialogue, not just a search for one right answer.
It takes all of us to create a society that truly values life and makes choices reflecting that shared humanity.
Well put. I think beyond the science, that's what Juve's after. Societal reflection on what kind of future we want.
It's about asking ourselves, is science serving us? Or are we letting it dictate our values?
That hits home for me. It's not about rejecting progress, but ensuring it aligns with what we believe about being human.
So how can our listeners keep exploring these ideas? Where do they go from here?
Well, they could dig deeper into Juve's work, or explore different perspectives on the beginning of life and what it means to be a person.
Reading, researching, maybe even some soul searching.
And most importantly, engaging in thoughtful discussions with others. Share what you've learned, but be open to listening too.
It's those conversations that will shape a future where science and technology work for everyone's well-being.
A great note to end on.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We're wrapping up our exploration of Professor Juve's research on the beginning of human life. Remember, we've delved into the science, the various viewpoints on personhood, and even touched on the ethical considerations surrounding practices like IVF.
Lots to think about. And now, we're going to zoom out a bit. Look at the bigger picture. What happens when we take Juve's main point, that human life begins at conception, and apply it to society at large?
Feels like that could have some major ripple effects, right? Touching so many different areas of life.
No doubt about it. And make us rethink a lot, especially in our social, legal, and medical systems. Take prenatal care, for example.
Okay, prenatal care.
If we acknowledge the developing fetus as a separate patient with its own rights, it changes how we view pregnancy altogether.
That's interesting. It's not just about the mother's health anymore. It's about two individuals, each with their own needs.
Exactly. And think about abortion laws. Granting a zygote full personhood status, that could lead to much stricter regulations, maybe even outright bans, depending on where you are.
It definitely raises questions about balancing individual choices with what society believes.
Huge questions, no doubt. And the impact on IVF, wow, that's a whole other conversation. The creation and storage of embryos. If they're considered people, what responsibilities do we have?
It's a lot to ponder. And, as compelling as Juve's arguments are, it's important to acknowledge that his perspective is just one piece of the puzzle, right?
Absolutely. When it comes to when life begins, what makes a person? There's a whole range of beliefs out there. And those beliefs, often they're tied up with religious, philosophical, even cultural values.
It's personal. So how do we even begin to navigate these differences in a way that respects everyone? It feels like it's easy to get stuck in our own little bubbles, to just shut down when someone disagrees with us.
I think the key really is approaching these conversations with empathy and respect. It's not about forcing anyone to change their beliefs,
So
right?
they're more about understanding, listening to each other.
Yeah, that's it. Trying to see where those beliefs come from, finding a way to coexist peacefully, even if we don't see eye to eye on every detail.
It doesn't mean we have to agree on absolutely everything.
Not at all. We might not all pinpoint the same starting line for life, but maybe we can agree on the importance of valuing human life at every stage, working towards a society that supports everyone's well-being.
I like that. So thinking practically now, What can we do as individuals, as a community, to actually move forward with all of this? It feels a little overwhelming, grappling with such huge ethical questions.
Well, education is a great starting point, wouldn't you say?
Oh, absolutely. Learning more, understanding more.
Yeah, understanding the science behind human development, but also the different ethical and philosophical viewpoints that exist.
So instead of avoiding these difficult conversations, we should be encouraging them, keeping them open and respectful, of course.
Precisely. And on a practical level, we've got to make sure women have access to accurate information, to good healthcare, reproductive healthcare, prenatal care, the whole 9 yards.
Giving people the tools they need to make informed choices.
Exactly. And as a society, we can't forget about research. And not just the kind that pushes boundaries scientifically. We need research that explores the ethical and social implications too.
So alongside all the exciting scientific breakthroughs, we need to be asking ourselves, what are the consequences? How does this affect humanity?
Right on. We need ethical guidelines, frameworks that keep us on track as we develop new technologies, making sure they're used responsibly for the benefit of all.
Wow, this deep dive has been truly eye-opening. We've gone from complex science to these huge ethical dilemmas, considering the impact on society as a whole.
It really highlights how science is woven into everything, right? Our values, beliefs, the very core of what it means to be human.
I'd say so. And as we wrap up, one final thought to leave you with. If science is pointing to the idea that human life is this continuous process from that very first moment of conception, well, then what responsibility do we have to protect and nurture that life at all stages, regardless of our personal convictions? It's a question worth pondering.
Couldn't have said it better myself. It's been a pleasure exploring all of this with you. I hope it encourages our listeners to keep thinking, keep talking, and keep asking these tough questions.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. If you're interested in learning more, be sure to check out Professor Ju's research. Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep diving deep.